Hey, Panther Percussion. Today I'm here with Stephen Versaevel. Stephen is the percussion professor at Montana State University. He's going to point us out on some snare techniques and kind of some stick selections. So, thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem. So the first thing, I guess, as far as your setup, some of you probably have done this before, just kind of a brief overview of what I believe as far as getting the maximum amount of playing ability out of your drum. First, the stand. Obviously, you want to have a decent size stand, a decent height stand. The biggest error I see is a lot of kids that try to use a drum set stand, which is going to be way too low for a lot of tall kids, to actually play at an effective level. So you always want to make sure that your stand can go up to the height that you need it to play. And that height is basically, for your drum head, for you to play on it effectively, it has to be at a kind of a certain angle from your body. I usually, and I've heard many people say you can do it either the snare drum height below your belt buckle, or you can take the thumb of your hand, open it like this, and bring it down, and where your pinky touches is where your snare drum, the top of your snare drum should be, or your batter head. And I can raise this up or lower it as much as I can, and me being a tall person, I need that height of that concert stand in order to play on it. So once I get the height kind of relatively in its place, I usually go into how I want my snare drum to lay on the actual basket here. So in my case, and in most cases I think as far as orchestral players that want to have the best sound possible, I have my snare strum or basic snare strainer or throw-off switch closest to me, closest to my body. I know exactly where that is at all times and if something happens where I'm not playing for an extended period of time, I can flip that strainer off relatively quickly and easily every single time. And you always want to have a good snare drum where you can actually flip it on and off with minimal sound. That way, as a percussionist, we know every noise we make is a sound, and we don't want to use that as less as possible. So, make sure you have a good snare strainer. The other reason why I have the snare strainer closest to me is because if you look at the bed of the actual snare drum itself, you can see where those snares are running along the actual snare drum itself, right? The snare bed. And why I want that is the snares to actually be in line with where I'm actually going to be playing on the head. Okay? So when I'm playing and have that snare drum on, I know I'm going to get the best snare response because the snares are directly below where my playing areas are going to be. And where those playing areas are, usually are going to be dependent sometimes on your dynamic level. I will usually only play, and you can see kind of the markings on the drum head, in this area here. I never really play in the middle because that is kind of what they call a node or a dead spot, much like you have like on marimba or any other drum. That's going to be the deadest area where you're going to be playing, or where you don't want to play because it's the deadest area. I usually go from anywhere from a dynamic level of forte, which is a little off-center, anywhere down to piano at the very edge. And you can kind of tell most good snare drums when you have that snare drum on and you're playing softly, you still have a really good snare drum sound to it. So this is kind of why, again, I have the snares directly in front of me, because my playing areas, and I always go out in order to play in this area here, not going back, and I'm playing this area here because then my elbows are behind me, I have tension in there, and that's kind of basically what we don't want, okay? So, and you can see I do have a little bit of a padding here, or a dampening system, because with that dampening system off, I have a pretty loud ring over the top there like that. So what this does is kind of take out that high-pitched sound. You still get a nice snare drum sound, but it doesn't have a whole lot of that tight ring to it, and you can play a little bit crisper, okay? So, that's kind of the setup there. Now, as far as the sticks, the way I hold them, obviously we're all going to be playing match grip, traditional grip. You can learn how to do that probably in a, you definitely want to get taught by a professional in that regard, because it is a little bit different. As far as the match grip, you're taking basically a stick here, and you're going to find basically a third of the way up the stick. And that is where your fulcrum is going to be. Now your thumb should be directly in line with that stick throughout the entire process until it kind of pivots like this. And your pointer finger is going to be directly across from it and curved around like so. So this creates what we call the fulcrum, or where that stick is actually going to bounce. Now you can actually take that and test it by simply bring your stick up in the air, kind of taking the fingers off the stick, which we don't want, but we're going to do at this point right now. And if that stick actually bounces off the head like so, it's going to be where the best fulcrum is. If I bring it up, probably maybe towards the ½ inch mark, it doesn't bounce nearly as well. And if I put it towards the back, it doesn't bounce either. So you want to find that fulcrum where that stick is going to bounce the best, and making sure that that fulcrum is there between your thumb and your pointer finger, and making sure that that is where it bounces the best. Then it's just a matter of making sure that the fingers are curved around comfortably, not too tight, not too loose, and make sure that that is controlling the stick. And the same thing with the left hand. So when you're playing on the drum head, then it's a matter of making sure that your sticks are playing in the exact same area. I usually will say, I usually try to tell my students that you kind of want to make a house a little bit in the formation of that, the form of your actual sticks. So I have the walls here, and then I have the roof up here, okay? And that's kind of general characteristic. You don't want to play too far in the middle here, because again, we're providing tension with your wrist and stuff, and not too far out, because again, it'll kind of go with the actual motion of the stick itself, if that makes sense. So basically my strokes and my fingers are really important as far as developing the stroke. The fulcrum as well, but I see what I see as far as errors is taking those fingers off the stick, which is a big no-no, because that's where your control is going to be lie, is within those fingers. So I always say that you always want to make sure that the finger is in contact with that stick at all times. Now that doesn't mean that the finger has to be in contact with the palm of the hand, because when you're playing what we call legato strokes, which are bouncing strokes, it is okay to separate sometimes. But you can see my fingers are still on the stick at all times, okay? Because if you think of the actual motion of everything, as far as your speed and agility, your fingers are actually the fastest part of your arm. Okay, it goes from your shoulder, you can only play so fast here, goes from your elbow, which can go a little bit faster, to your wrist, to the fingers, which are the actual fastest. Okay, so you always want to make sure that the wrist is bending, as you can see here, and my fingers are working in conjunction with my wrist in order to produce that stroke. I don't need a lot of arm motion because it's not necessary unless you're going to be playing really loud, which in case in a concert or orchestral situation, you probably won't need to do that. So you always want to make sure your playing areas, whether it be what dynamic it is, are out in front of you like so. Make sure that snare bed is underneath. Have a nice house and be able to play those nice legato strokes with those fingers and that wrist, or the fingers attached to the stick, and the wrist actually providing a lot of motion too in that stroke. Alright, so now we're going to talk about stick selection and what sticks work well in different situations. So for me, and I know a lot of people are probably in the same boat as far as professionals out there in the country, is that the size of the stick really matters in how you sound behind the instrument. In most orchestral playing, or most playing on concert snare drums indoors, I have kind of a medium size stick. Okay, so you can think of it as maybe a 2B as far as I'm talking about here, the shaft of the mallet here and how big that is. As far as the tip is concerned, I'm not too concerned as far as, each tip will have their own kind of sound characteristics, but I've seen a lot of orchestral tips that have either an acorn bead, it has a round bead, which I prefer, it has even smaller beads than that sometimes for soft articulate passages, or bigger rounder beads for something that you need a little more depth to. The thing about the shaft of the stick itself provides kind of the sound characteristic of what you're playing. So if I'm playing on a concert snare drum, I want something that has a little bit of depth to it, has a little more, it has some meat to it. The biggest problem I see sometimes of players is that, especially in the high school realm, is that they're in marching band mode or they're in drumline mode, and the only sticks they have are marching band sticks. Now the problem is that you can see the shaft here is much thicker than the actual concert snare drum sticks that I use. And the problem here is that this is strictly for outdoor playing because it provides projection outside. And you're playing on something that's a lot tighter, sometimes a Kevlar head, which case you need that projection, need something that provides a little more weight to get into that head and make it sound good. When you get inside onto a plastic head or mylar head, playing with that type of weight, playing with that type of velocity, sometimes will provide a little bit too much for the head itself. It'll dent a lot, it'll break, and even the snare drum itself will be maybe a little bit too heavy, a little bit too loud because you're trying to blend in with your ensemble around you, in which case this can be a little too much. The biggest thing is that it'll damage the head a lot because it'll provide divots or sometimes even break the head itself. So just be careful in doing that. And in other cases too, with drum set sticks, I prefer something even a little bit smaller, like a 5A or a 7A, because of the fact that I like to have maybe a little bit more touch and feel, I guess, on that situation. The biggest thing that I try to separate my concert sticks from my drum set sticks, because my drum set sticks get torn up pretty easily because sometimes you do rim shots, and it's especially true in the case that when you have wood tip concert snare drum sticks and you're playing on a cymbal, that cymbal will damage that tip or make it sound, it'll start to break, it'll start to chip. When you start to play on then concert snare drum heads, that sound characteristic, you won't get an even sound between right and left. So I would say if you're playing on a cymbal, maybe a plastic tip head, but you can use wood on drum set too, but the biggest reason is sometimes these concert sticks can be a little bit too heavy for what the situation if you're in a small combo and those types of things. And the biggest thing is basically the tip of that head, or tip of the actual stick itself, not chipping or fraying and providing two different sounds, in which case the evenness of that will be greatly affected. So hopefully that helps out in your situation. Thanks.
Watch me!